So Angular 22 has introduced the debounce signal. Now what does that mean and how it works? But before that, let's see why this was introduced and what the problems that it has fixed. Now let's say I have an application over here and the applications looks something like this. It has some navigation over here on the top, the default, reactive, the signal based and debounce, and these all are having the same UI, that is a search input in the center, and when we type anything in the input, I want to call an API, right? Right now I'm not calling an API, I'm just consoling all those terms that have been typed over here in the console log. So that can look like an actual API call, but we are not calling an actual API call, but we are only having the consoles in the console log. Okay. So whenever I type anything in the search box, let's say Angular, you see we have all of these consoles over here, right? So as soon as I type an A or an Angular, right, A and G and all that, everything is console. Now if I am calling an API based on the search, right, so I would be calling all these number of APIs, right? So that is not feasible, right? So this is the default, and this is what we are going to solve with the debounce signal. Now let's see how this is fixed with reactive forms. Let's say I have a reactive form over here. Okay, now this is the reactive form and we have the same search input over here. Now if I type anything over here, let's say Angular, right? Now you see only Angular is typed over here, right? We see only the console. Let's clear that. And if I type again, let's say Angular over here, okay, you see Angular is typed. Now this is fixed, right? The issue of calling multiple API calls on the input characters whenever I type anything into the search input, that is fixed with the reactive, right? Now let's see how this code works. Now if I go to the code and if I go to the reactive form method inside the reactive form TS file, now this is my reactive, right? Now you see we have a lot of boilerplate code over here, right? First I create a form over here, okay, and based on that I create a search input, okay, and that's it, that is a field or the form control, okay, and I am just subscribing to the value changes of the cells, right, based on the value changes.pipe, right, or within that pipe RxJS I'm using the debounce time, okay, so that is 300 milliseconds, and I'm using the distinct until, right, so until the actual value changes, this will not subscribe, right, this will not call the actual API. So now we are seeing that this is fixed with the reactive form, but we have a lot of boilerplate that is not required, right? Now if we go to the signal based solution for this input problem, and if I type anything over here, right, Angular, you see as soon as I type all the characters, for each character we have the API calls, right? So we have the API call for an A or the AN or the ANG and all of that, right? So with the signal based, we do not have the solution, right? We do not have the expected solution what we need, right? Now if I go to the code for this signal based solution, and if you see the code, I only have a signal which is search, okay. Now as soon as there is a change in the input, let's say there is a change into the input of that input field or that input control, I'm just updating the search value, right, and this search value is updated, and whenever that signal changes, I'm just using that into the effect, right? So this effect will be called every time there is a change into the search signal, right? Now whenever I typed anything into the search signal or the search input, the effect is called, right, and we can call the API over here, right, but this is also not feasible, right, because for each character the effect is called and then the API calls will be called, right, for each character. So we do not need that as well, right? So this is the signal based solution. Now if I go to the debounced based solution, which was introduced recently. Now if I type anything, let me clear the console over here, and if I type anything over here, Angular, right, now you see only the ANG LAR is typed, right? We see only that particular console, right, because there is only a single API call, and that's what we want, right? We do not want to call API on each of the characters typed into the search input, right? We want to call an API based on the search, right? The input that we type should be debounced, and only a single API should be called as soon as I type anything over here, right? Angular, right? Now there will be an API call with this search term, only the Angular, right? Not each of the characters. Now how this works, if I go to the debounce signals based solution over here, and you see I have the search term, right? This again search term is a signal which we have already seen in the signal based solution, and we have another thing which is called debounced search term, right? And this debounced search term uses the debounced function or this debounced API which is coming from the @Angular core. Okay, now this needs a query. Now this query is on which item or on which signal item should this be debounced. So I added the search term, right? Not calling the actual search term, not calling its actual value, but the signal itself, right? Now as soon as I added the signal, I have added the how much time or how much interval should it take to debounce, right? So I added the 3 milliseconds over here, 300 milliseconds that we already added into the reactive form solution, right? Now once this debounce search term is added, right? Now again, based on the input change, I have added the search term.set, right? The same thing that we did into the signal based solution, right? The only thing that changed was this debounced function, which was coming from the @Angular core, right? And nothing else. And then once we have the debounce search term created, right, we can use that into the resource, right? This HTTP resource is used for calling an external API or calling an external dependency whenever there is a change into the params that you define over here, right? Now if you see, I'm calling the resource over here, right? And in the params I have just added the debounce search term dot value, right? This debounce search term exposes the value method. Okay, so on that value I'm just passing that parameter goes over here on the loader. Okay, now once that parameter is added over here, I'm just consoling that, right? And then we can call the API over here, right? So this API will be called only once as soon as you end up typing after 300 milliseconds, right? So that's how the debounced signal works. Now this is the game changer, right? Why? Because earlier we used to have the reactive forms, right? This also provides the RxJS functions, right? RxJS operators, which we can use to have the debounce. But you see, there is a lot of boilerplate code, right? And there is a subscription as well, right? So you subscribe to an observable, right? Now you should always unsubscribe to any observable. Now that is another overhead to unsubscribe to all of the subscriptions when you subscribe to any observable in your component, right? So this overhead is removed when we added the debounced based solution for the API call, right? So we can now call the API without subscribing to anything and without worrying about this unsubscription, right? So that's how debounce signal works. Now instead of adding the default timer right over here, as I have mentioned, the 300 milliseconds, you can have a wait function over here, right? Instead of adding the milliseconds duration, you can pass a function that returns a promise, right? Now as soon as this promise resolves, the resource resolves, right? So that's how you can add a function to it as well without adding a definite or milliseconds duration, right? Now there is one thing important about the debounce function. While the user is still typing, the resource status is still loading, right? The value function still returns the last resolved value, or your UI never goes blank mid typing, right? So once the timer fires, the new value settles and the status function becomes resolved. One edge case worth knowing is that if the resource signals or the source signals throws an error, the resource enters then error state immediately, right? There is no timer on that. So the resource will not return the error after certain milliseconds. So if there is an error into the signal, it will return the error immediately, right? So Angular doesn't make the user wait after a failure. By default, debounce function uses object.is to compare values, which is strict equality. So if your signal holds an object like a filter config, you'll want a custom equality function so it doesn't re-trigger when irrelevant field changes, right? It only triggers when the field you care about changes, right? So that's how you can add the equality operator based on what type of signal values your signal holds, right? Now this debounce should not be called inside ng-on-init or inside any method. They should only be called inside an injection context. Okay, so that means a class field or an inside a constructor, right? You cannot add it or you cannot call it inside the ng-on-init or any method of your component. Now let's recap what debounced actually gives you. a single line to debounce any signal. There is no RxJS required. Debounce returns a resource. So you get ease loading function, value function, and the status functions for free. It supports a custom wait function as I already described for adaptive debounce logic. And by default, the built-in equality checking is to prevent unnecessary triggers. Now there is an automatic cleanup, no subscriptions and no ng on destroy, right? So one thing is to be aware of that this is still marked as experimental in Angular 22. The API may shift before it's stable, but the direction is clear. This is how Angular wants you to handle time-based reactivity going forward. Are you already using the resource in your projects, or are you still on the RxJS path? Drop it in the comment. Like the video and subscribe to Frontend Force for more Angular deep dives. See you in the next one.